Hello. In the last clip, I helped you to understand the qualifications that an interpreter should have if they're going to work in a K-12 setting. What I'd like to do in this short clip is to give you some understanding of what's the interpreter's role and what's your role as the teacher. So the first slide that you're looking at gives you some of the ideas of what's common across all school districts, across all countries for the interpreter's role. So obviously one of the key roles that they have is to prepare for interpreting. So just like you're preparing for every class that you walk into, interpreters will also prepare, because it's not just about hearing a word and signing a word. They have to be able to understand the content if they're going to be able to interpret it accurately or effectively. So by preparation, this means that they'll be wanting to read the textbooks that the students are reading, that they'll want to be able to have an understanding from you about the way that you're constructing the learning. They'll want to be able to look at any slides or PowerPoints that you're using, video clips, YouTube clips, films, and they'll also be able to start to think about a vocabulary list and some of the concepts and vocabulary work that's going to frame the particular lesson. So the preparation for interpreting is a key piece. Sometimes when teachers tell me, well, I look over and the interpreter's just reading. Really, how hard is their job? Well, hopefully when they're reading, they're actually reading work that is contributing to the preparation of them being able to do a better job of interpreting for you in the classroom. The second major piece of an interpreter's role is to be able to cooperate with teachers and other educational staff in order to prepare for the interpreting, to be able to arrange the environment so that it's suitable for interpreting, and to be able to analyze when the interpreting is working well and when it's not working well. So that cooperation piece is a key part of understanding that they're a member of the educational team. Thirdly, obviously, they're there to interpret, and they're there to interpret in the classroom. And as I said on an earlier clip, they're also there to be able to interpret all of the other kinds of aspects that make up what it means to have an active school community. And this can create some challenges, obviously, in terms of the hours that they're paid for and the kinds of other demands that a school has. But we want them to be able to interpret in the classroom and in other settings. They're also going to have to take an active role in analyzing their own work and giving attention to their own professional development and their own professional performance. And this is a key piece that many schools struggle with because they don't have anybody who can actually supervise the interpreter. Sometimes when I go into a school, I'll ask who does the active supervision and mentoring of the interpreter, and I'm told that the itinerant teacher of the deaf might be doing that, who may not sign, let alone interpret, or they'll tell me that the principal does that or the teacher does it. While the teacher may be able to perform the day-to-day supervision around the preparation pieces, if you're not an interpreter, it's not likely that you can perform a self-analysis of language to language, interpreting to interpreting. So that piece may be something that your school district has to self-contract out. As well, in cooperation with the school and the student, interpreters typically have a role of informing other students and educational staff about interpreting. So it might be that at the beginning of every semester, the beginning of the year, the interpreter has some time with the classroom to talk with students about what does it mean to work with an interpreter in their classroom. Also, they participate in educational meetings and comment on the interpreting. Don't comment on the teaching, don't comment on IEP goals necessarily, but comment on how well the interpreting is serving the student. And they may have other duties as defined by the school program. But what's key is that you take away the idea that if the interpreter is not in your classroom, the child doesn't have access to the language that's in use in your classroom. So sometimes I'll see teachers who are just asking the interpreters, would you mind going out and photocopying this for me? Well, really, that's not the nature of their task. It's not the nature of their training. They've got much more training than that, but anytime you ask them to be not present, then you decide that you will not provide access for the deaf student. Sometimes teachers say, well, there's nothing happening, it's independent work. But independent work is interesting for me because often when I'm in the class observing during what's quiet time or independent work, I see the teacher moving around and I see her talking to individual students. That conversation can be overheard by other hearing students who then pick up and are guided by that direction. I also see other students asking questions of the teacher and the teacher answering them. If the interpreter is not present, none of those incidental moments will be interpreted for the deaf student, and so they've lost that learning opportunity. So that's about the goal of their role, is staying present in the interpreting role. In the next slide, you've seen the contrast between what's the interpreter's role and what's the teacher's role. So I've said that all of those things on the left-hand side of your screen belong to the interpreter, so prepping, providing interpretation, and working with a team. And so part of your role then is to obviously help the interpreter to prepare. And I don't mean that this is going to take you hours and hours, but just as you're preparing for your own work, being able to share that information. Some schools do this very effectively by sharing lesson plans, being able to do the larger plan for the entire course, putting that on an intraweb format so that the interpreter can get it, sharing PowerPoints, just giving a heads up that today we're going to deal with Chapter 3, giving them a heads up that next week I want them to be able to do these things. It requires that you're in regular communication with the interpreter, that the interpreter is not just somebody who sits over there and is signing, but you and the interpreter are going to have to work as a team, and that sometimes you're going to have to adjust your strategies in order to accommodate having a deaf student in the classroom, in order to allow for effective interpreting versus the illusion of effective interpreting. What interpreters don't do is provide classroom instructions. So I think in the last video clip I talked a little bit about a case study where the interpreter is taking on many of the decisions about teaching. So she's doing the pull-out time with the student, she's doing the tutoring, and in some ways she's delivering the program under the supervision of the teacher. But it's not something that that person is trained to do, and the more pull-out time that student has, the more one-to-one time they have with somebody who's not necessarily a qualified teacher, the less access they have then to the academic engagement. Interpreters don't typically advise you on your teaching strategies. That's your area of competence. They don't typically copy, laminate, find resources for you, and they don't typically take notes for the student when they're not present. So those would be things that it would be inappropriate to ask the interpreter to do. But obviously the interpreter is another adult in the school, and so if they see a situation that's going to create a moment of danger or a potential risk for another student, they as an adult in the classroom will stop students from running, and they will, report a fight that's going on in the classroom. Those kinds of things, obviously, as another adult in the school, they will manage just as you would expect anyone to do. But what we would like you not to do is to allow the interpreter to assume full responsibility for the teaching and for the deaf students program. That really needs to be done in consultation between you, the parents, the student, and hopefully master teachers of the deaf who have that expertise to offer your school district. There's a slide that speaks to the recommended hours. So in terms of the role of an interpreter, what we know is that when an interpreter works typically more than 20 hours of direct interpreting, that they are at risk of injury. And so that can be really challenging when you're thinking about serving a student in an inclusive environment, because if you are asking the interpreter to work 6 or 7 hours of every day, 5 days a week, and if they're, for example, at the junior high or high school, where the work-rest ratio is very disproportionate, that you likely will have an interpreter who's injured within 3 or 4 months of working with that student. So there are some recommended guidelines around safety precautions and recommended hours of interpreting. This has some fiscal implications, obviously, for a school district, but again, if we are thinking about quality access for the deaf student, again, we have to think about wellness, and best to have this audited and plan for the delivery of services. I think what all of this means for you as a teacher is that, first of all, we have to be able to make sure that we've got a qualified interpreter, that we recognize the limitations of interpreting, that we have done a thorough review about whether the student is destined to succeed in an inclusive environment or whether they require some other environment. And those environments can change. So for example, we've had some students who have started out with a direct educational experience, gone to a mediated education for the middle years in junior high school, and then have gone back to a congregated model where they're with deaf peers for their own graduation in high school, but with an interpreter for some of the classrooms in high school. So again, the model can shift, and if we're being really careful about planning for success, then I think we'll take care of all of those features. In the next clip, I'll talk about some of the strategies that I think you can adopt and change in your own practice that would allow for more effective interpreting. Thanks.